thank you for joining us for another installment from our series of interviews for the Sciences of the Origin project, which explores philosophical and methodological foundations of the scientific quest for the origins of universe, life, and mind across disciplinary interactions. This project is supported by the University of Oxford's New Horizons for Science and Religion in Central and Eastern Europe, founded by the John Templeton Foundation. My name is Janko Nešić, and I'm working as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Belgrade. And today I will be talking to Kristina Musholt. So, Kristina is a professor of cognitive anthropology in the Department of Philosophy at Leipzig University. She's also a co-director and principal investigator at the newly established Leipzig Research Center for Early Child Development and a faculty member of the International Max Planck Research School on Neuroscience of Communication. So, Kristina, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to do this interview and talk to me as part of this project that we are doing.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation.
No problem. So, I wanted to talk to you about some themes some topics from philosophy of mind, self-consciousness, social cognition, and conceptual, non-conceptual forms of representation. So, the work that you're doing on these things, and that relates to the problems of the origin that we are working on. So let us start with some more specific themes that you have worked on, that you have written in your book, Thinking About Oneself, and in several different papers. So you talk about self-consciousness, and by self-consciousness here we mean the ability to think I thoughts, and you discuss the relation between self-consciousness and intersubjectivity. Mm-hmm. So you develop a sort of a solution to the problem of self-consciousness, if we can say that, and in how it develops in human beings, why it is important, what it encompasses, what we mean by self-consciousness, why it is so important, and so on. So what would be the origins of self-consciousness? Can you please explain what you mean by self-consciousness, what other maybe types of self-consciousness or self-awareness are there in human beings, and why self-consciousness is, first of all, so important to try and figure out how it develops in humans?
Yeah, okay. So there's several different ways in which people talk about self-consciousness. So as you already said, the way in which I understand it is in terms of the ability to think I thoughts. Mm-hmm. So something like I'm sitting here talking to you right now would be an example of an I thought. Okay. And the reason that I think self-consciousness in this sense is particularly interesting is because it lies at the heart of what I take to be specific human abilities regarding our ability to develop an identity, a sense of self, asking questions about ourselves, and ultimately also questions of moral significance. So in order to ask yourself the question, who you want to be, what kind of person you want to be, what kind of values you have, what kind of decisions you take to be the right decisions. In order to be able to do that, you need to be able to think thoughts of that kind. In my book, I don't really talk very much about identity and morality, but it's something that ultimately motivates a lot of my thinking in this area. But I'm rather interested in how this sort of fundamental ability to really think about yourself, reflect on yourself, and then ultimately ask those kind of questions, how that develops and how it arises out of more basic forms of being aware of yourself, such as having a sense of your body and your surroundings. And my idea is that basically self-consciousness in this sense of thinking about yourself, reflecting on yourself, develops hand in hand with your ability to think about others. So I try to sketch a process of development which proceeds in several different degrees, and where we can distinguish different degrees of self-awareness on the one hand and different degrees of understanding others and being aware of others on the other hand. And I think that these two, being aware of yourself and being aware of others, that they really go hand in hand. Yeah, that's the basic idea. So self-consciousness in this sense is kind of a contrastive notion, in the sense that you develop the ability to think about yourself by contrasting yourself, by contrasting your perspective on the world, and ultimately also your values, your identity, etc., with the perspectives of others. And in order to be able to do so, of course, you need to understand that there are others who have their own perspective on the world.
So yes, so the preceding kind of self-awareness that, let's say, we have from birth is like pre-reflective self-awareness, and later comes the reflective type of self-awareness that we call self-consciousness in this context as thinking I thoughts, having a narrative self. Do you see this layering of the self, that there is maybe a minimal self of pre-reflective self-consciousness and then something like intersubjective or narrative self? What do you think about those notions?
Yes, I think you can distinguish a kind of more primitive or basic sense of self, and a lot of people call this pre-reflective self-awareness, or some people call it minimal self, or ipseti, or basic self-awareness, which is often, like I said, associated with just a basic sense of your body. I'm sometimes hesitant to call that self-awareness, because I think that in having this awareness, you're not really representing yourself as such. And so we have to be careful with how we use that notion. But when you look at certain phenomenological accounts, for example, the account provided by Dan Zahavi, who uses this notion of pre-reflective self-awareness. So he is very adamant that we should call this a form of self-consciousness, but at the same time, he also defends a non-representationalist view of that. So in that sense, I think I'm in agreement with him. There's other researchers who think that already at the very basic level, there is a form of self-representation involved. And I would want to question that. I would rather call it something like implicitly self-related information or self-concerning information, but I think that the self is not really represented as an intentional object in these basic forms of awareness or consciousness, and that this kind of explicit representation of yourself as an I, as a subject, that only arises at the reflective level. But then I think that the danger with these dichotomies is that we lose sight of the different levels in between the very basic and the reflective, right? So part of what I'm interested in is kind of what happens in between. How do we get from one to the other? Yes,
can you talk please more about this, the development of this process between these, between the pre-reflective and the reflective, how we get to the reflective self-conscious. That is the basis of your research, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, in philosophy, we often have these dichotomies, right? So we distinguish between the pre-reflective, the reflective, or some people distinguish between non-conceptual, conceptual. And I think these distinctions are important, but again, human cognition is more complex than that. So there's sort of things happening in between that. And with respect to the development of self-consciousness and related to that, our understanding of others, I think one thing that we as philosophers can also learn from cognitive science, developmental psychology, is kind of how this develops in children. So that's partly why I'm interested in looking at the development of children in this area. And so we can see, for instance, that children are very much social beings, of course, from the start. So we're very sensitive to social cues. We have the phenomenon of infants shortly after birth already being able to imitate faces, for instance. But I would say that that's probably a process that occurs kind of at the automatic level. There's some kind of matching going on, but it's not like the infant is really aware of itself as being different.
The question is, it conscious, it is phenomenal? So.
Yeah, exactly. So I wouldn't sort of over-interpret that, but I think it's important that we are very sensitive to social cues from the start. And then later on, we find at the age of 9 months, for instance, children begin to engage in these what developmental psychologists call triadic interactions. So they point to things, they want to engage the other person's attention, they want to make sure that, you know, both people are attending to the same thing, are aware of the same thing. And I think what we find here is that there is, at the kind of procedural level, at the level of knowledge how, a kind of interaction with the other as another subject that can be attending or not attending to the same things. But still, it's not quite clear yet that the child is really explicitly distinguishing between themselves and the others, right? They're engaged in this kind of interaction. And in being engaged in this, they have knowledge how to attract the attention of the other or how to pick up on emotional cues. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's already an explicit self-other differentiation going on. The next level I would distinguish is kind of at the age of 14 to 18 months, when we have, on the one hand, things like mirror self-recognition. So the children are able to recognize themselves in the mirror, which often is taken as an indicator for self-awareness. But what makes it particularly interesting is that it goes hand in hand with also social phenomena, such as showing basic forms of empathy, showing forms of shyness or embarrassment or coyness, and interacting with others in a way that suggests that we now have a more explicit sense that, oh, here am I, and there are you, and you can see me, and I can see you, and that has an emotional effect on the child as well. But it might not be something that the child is able to explicitly express in terms of concepts yet, right? So it's not clear to what extent that really is reflective or conceptual knowledge. And so this continues to develop. So at the age of 2 years, we have an increasing ability to understand visual perspectives, for instance, to understand that what I can see is not necessarily what the other can see, and vice versa.
Taking perspectives, basically.
Yeah, and then finally, at the age of 4 to 5 years, we get what people call a kind of an explicit theory of mind, where children, for instance, are able to understand that what they believe is not necessarily what the other person believes. And importantly, also that beliefs, that representations about the world can be wrong. So they can attribute false beliefs to others. And that's another important step towards really understanding ourselves as subjects, as beings in the world that represent the world a certain way, and that can disagree with respect to how we represent the world. And then, of course, the development continues, but basically at that age from 4 to 5, I would say we have at least the fundamental abilities for something like a reflective self-consciousness and an understanding of yourself and others as beings that represent the world in a certain way.
Okay, thank you. So would you say that at the time, basically the person, being a person, is formed? Before that you're a subject, and when you know that you're a subject, you become a person, or something like that? That's the birth of personality, maybe we should.
Yeah, maybe. So of course, I mean, every parent and everyone who interacts with young children will probably say that they have a personality right from birth, right? So babies are different from the start. And, you know, the whole question of character traits and personality and so on is a very interesting one, but maybe slightly separate from that. But in the sense in which we talk about personhood in philosophy, namely a person being a subject that can reflect upon itself, that can ask questions of moral significance, that can ask whether to use kind of Frankfurt's notion, your first order preferences are something that you should really be endorsing or that you should be rejecting, right? So those are kind of rather demanding abilities that we associate with personhood in philosophy. And for that, I think you need this more reflective conceptual understanding of yourself.
Yes, okay. So as you tried to show through this, going through stages, how it develops, how we get to self-consciousness in this reflective sense. You talked about how we have the relations with other subjects. So intersubjectivity is the basis of this development. It is what makes possible this development. Mm-hmm. So do you think, you said that the self-understanding and understanding others is going hand in hand, is going in parallel. So if we have like a first person perspective on ourselves and on others, a third person perspective, if we are observers of others, so is there possibility for a second person perspective to be of importance in this discussion and in development? Would you say that a second person perspective is something that is real, or something that exists in more like phenomenological approaches to this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the second person perspective is actually extremely important, because the way in which we engage with others is really not so much in terms of observing them and establishing theories about their behavior, as some cognitive scientists would actually characterize it. I mean, some of the literature is kind of framed in those terms, but I think that's misguided, because our interactions with others are as other subjects. They affect us. They have emotional repercussions, but also they have this normative dimension. So, I mean, first of all, what I find really fascinating is that the child is being treated by their caregivers as an intentional being from the start, even when it's not really clear yet whether and what kind of intentions the child really has, right? So, I mean, take a basic example. The baby might just be randomly moving its hands, but the mother or the father interprets this as, oh, you want the rattle, right? And you give them the rattle. And so you read them as an intentional being, you treat them as an intentional being, you address them as a you. And I think that's actually fundamental for the process of the child actually becoming a subject that can respond to these kind of demands ultimately as well, right? So, I mean, to treat someone as a subject also means that I have certain expectations, that I have certain demands on them, that I ultimately, once they are a fully developed person, I expect them to act on the basis of reasons, for instance, and I can demand that they provide reasons for the decisions. So there's a phenomenology, you can analyze this in phenomenological terms. There's also a really interesting tradition in German idealism, when you think of the work of Fichte, for instance, or Hegel, that also emphasizes that. But yeah, in general, I think it's very important to understand that we don't engage with others as objects, but always as two subjects engaging with each other. So we're mutually recognizing each other as subjects. We have certain expectations. And to begin with, this is very much scaffolded by the adults, because the child is not really a fully intentional subject yet, but it becomes such a subject through being treated as such by others.
So there's another question there. Would you say some go even so far, not just saying that the development of person or self-consciousness and so on is scaffolded on intersubjectivity or interactions with other subjects, but that we are as subjects at the beginning of our development, very early on, so much dependent on our caregivers, on those that are near us, that this is a type of co-embodiment, co-subject happening on very early on. So of course we do not have conceptions of ourselves. That is something that happens very, very later on. but even in this pre-reflective sense, some say that or think argue that subjects are anonymous or something undivided from others. So would you say that even on the pre-reflective notion of a minimal self, for example, would you say that even the minimal self could be constituted or made possible or somehow enabled by intersubjectivity or sociality or something besides the subject itself?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think there's so some people deny this and they say that at the very minimal level, this self-other relation doesn't really play such a fundamental role yet. It only comes in later when we're at the level of the narrative self or the reflective self. And I think logically speaking, it's not logically necessary that the minimal self is constituted through others. But as a matter of fact, if you look at the kind of beings that we are, I would say that for human beings, it is the case that our subjectivity, our sense of self, even at the very minimal level, is very much intertwined with others, and actually even more so at the minimal level, kind of along the lines that you just suggested. So there isn't really, when you think of the infant or even before birth, of course, when you think of pregnancy,
yes.
there's absolutely no way to really distinguish between, or it's very, it's an interesting question. I mean, that would be a different topic, how you think really about also the ontological relation between the unborn child and the mother. But in any case, there is certainly a very strong co-regulation and intertwinement going on. But also after birth, of course, that continues, right? So the way the baby experiences themselves, the way they regulate their homeostatic balance, whether they experience hunger or not, what kind of emotions they experience, that's all very much dependent on their interactions with their caregivers. And at the start, I would say the baby probably doesn't distinguish between itself and the caregiver, and this process of self-other differentiation and really gaining a sense of yourself as being different from the other, that's something that I think actually only develops over time.
Yes. That's basically the process of individuation or being separate subjects from the others. Okay. And they are calling upon taking this scientific cognitive science and psychological empirical just evidence that there is so much correlation and connection is too close between the caregiver and the child, even in the sense of interoception, for example, in the child, and through social touch, which is very important for the first months of even before birth, of course, even in utero.
There's a lot of really fascinating research in that area currently, of course. I mean, a lot of empirical research that's really interesting.
So you think that this kind of research, empirical research, is very important for philosophical debates and making conceptual distinctions and making discussions, conceptual, philosophical discussion about this problem?
Yes,
yeah. Of course, you would agree with that. So maybe next question would be related to that. So are there any, like, let's say, dangers of selection effects or biases that could happen in such psychological research when it comes to the early development of human beings and their sense of self, for example?
I'm not sure if so can you say a little bit more of what kind of biases you have in mind there, or
in the research itself, in findings, or when thinking about these notions, when we apply these notions to the early developmental phases of human beings? So
I mean, So generally speaking, I mean, if we talk about social sciences in general, of course, there's always a danger of basically drawing an analogy from your own experience to others without sufficiently reflecting the way in which, of course, we're all biased, we're all kind of influenced by our society, by the way in which we were raised, by kind of different social norms and so on. And I mean, yeah, think about, for instance, I mean, one piece of, one example for that is things like gender stereotypes, for instance. So there's interesting experiments where you show videos of very young infants, really, and you show the same video of the same baby, as it were, reacting to something. Like, I think one famous experiment was you have a jumping jack, like, you know, this thing that jumps out of the box, and babies often sort of start crying when they see that. So you show people the same video and tell one group of people that it's a boy and tell the other group of people it's a girl, and you ask them to interpret what they're seeing. And the group that's being told that it's a girl, they will describe this as the baby being scared and afraid of the jumping jack, whereas the group that's been told that it's a boy will often describe what they see as the baby being upset or angry, even though it's the same video, right? So we certainly have these biases that go into the interpretation, of course, of our findings, but also that, of course, have an influence on the kind of questions that we ask to begin with and the way in which we set up our experiments. And this applies not just to social science, it applies also, of course, to philosophical thinking. So, I mean, one reason, for instance, that there's not very much thinking, with some notable exceptions, of course, on, for example, pregnancy and the ontological status of the unborn baby in relation to the mother, is partly because, you know, that's maybe not a question that occurred to many of the sort of more dominant male philosophers over the past centuries, right? I mean, it raises interesting metaphysical questions, and there's now some projects who attempt to address these questions. But for a long time, people were engaging in very abstract thought experiments to raise these questions of identity, rather than looking at actual real world examples research that are right in front of our eyes. Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, there's always that danger. And I think the only way to address it is really by, on the one hand, being aware of the fact that as researchers, we are all biased in certain ways, whether we want to or not. And to try to become aware of our biases, but also then by increasing diversity and by engaging with researchers from other cultures, other backgrounds, other disciplines. And yeah, just basically making research as diverse as possible.
Yeah. Okay. So similar to this, do you think that if you think that cognitive science and empirical research is very important to be the foundation of philosophical research in these matters, for example, of development of consciousness, self-consciousness, personhood, and so on, would you say that the study of disorders of the self and self-consciousness in psychopathology is also very important, or that it can provide some new evidence and some insights for philosophical debates?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I'm not sure whether I would say that cognitive science is fundamental to philosophy, or philosophy is I mean, I don't know. I think it's a kind of back and forth relationship. I would see them more as on an equal footing, perhaps. Or yeah, I mean, depending on what your starting point is, of course, you know, you might say philosophy in terms of being focused on conceptual analysis is perhaps prior to then the empirical research that addresses certain, because you need to clarify concepts before you can then ask empirical questions about them. But yeah, to come back to your question, yes, I think we can gain really interesting insights from the study of psychopathology. You know, like the self, for instance, usually when we introspect or when you look at philosophical analyses of the self, it generally appears to be very unified, and it's only through certain breakdowns in the experience of the self and through the study of psychopathologies that we become aware of the fact that the self might be much more fragile and much less unified than it appears to us. And so that can then raise really interesting new philosophical and as well as empirical questions. For sure. At the same time, I'm a little bit wary of being too quick in, drawing very general conclusions about the self and consciousness on the basis of abnormal or pathological experiences. So we have to be a little bit careful there as well.
Yes, I remember you wrote in your book, for example, thinking about ourselves, there is a part of the chapter on how intersubjectivity influences the development of self-consciousness, how we go to self-consciousness, and we can use like the research that we have on autism, for example, in children, infantile autism, but again, have to be cautious not to overgeneralize something that is perhaps just about one psychopathology, one.
Yeah, especially since, of course, with autism, it's particularly difficult because it's really a spectrum disorder, and it's very, very difficult to draw any general conclusions from that.
But yes. What could we see, for example, from autism for the development of self-consciousness, or for the importance of intersubjectivity in humans in general, for the development of personhood and the self-understanding of ourselves and others?
Well, I mean, some people argue that, so generally speaking, people think that people with autism have certain difficulties in understanding others. And there's some controversy as to where exactly that difficulty lies. So it used to be in the past that people thought that people with autism don't really have a theory of mind. I think nowadays the consensus is more that actually they can acquire a theory of mind in the sense of, if you give them rules for interpreting behavior, they're quite good at learning those rules and using those rules in trying to interpret what others are up to. But what they lack is perhaps this more basic, embodied, effective kind of way of relating to others. And so that makes it very hard for them to engage in these more intuitive kind of day-to-day interactions. Of course, you could also look at it from the other side and say that because the way in which they engage with the world is different from the way in which neurotypical people engage with the world, we have as much trouble understanding them as they have trouble understanding us, right? But yeah, what it reveals, I think, that there's these different aspects or different dimensions to understanding others and ourselves. Some more at the kind of explicit theoretical level, some more at this more basic, intuitive, emotional, affective level. And by looking at ways in which these processes of engaging with each other can be disturbed, our attention can be drawn to these different dimensions, and we can try to make conceptual distinctions that perhaps we weren't previously able to make in the same way.
Yes, that's how it would affect the philosophical conceptions and debates in turn from the research. So, would you, I guess, probably agree with the enactive approaches to consciousness, for example, and human interaction, and how do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of in terms of my training, I come more from the kind of analytical tradition. And I have to admit that I sometimes have trouble completely understanding this literature. But I do like the general approach and to try to characterize interactions in terms of, things like participatory sense making and there being these loops, that are continuously happening between two subjects interacting with each other. That to me seems very plausible and makes a lot of sense to me. But I'm not very much engaged in that particular kind of literature myself, just because my background is slightly different.
Yes. Okay. So you would defend more a representationalist approach to consciousness than a relationist approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think
do
it's
you
very
see
important.
this like different approaches? Like
no, not really. No. Yeah, so I mean, one issue actually I have with the enactivist literature perhaps is that there's this strong tendency towards an anti-representationalism. And I tend to think also on the basis of engaging with cognitive science and neuroscience that the notion of representation is a useful and important notion that I would not want to give up on. Of course, it's important to appreciate, and that's why I'm interested in non-conceptual content, that there is such a thing as a non-linguistic, non-conceptual understanding and engaging with the world. But it seems to me that throwing out the notion of representation altogether is maybe going a step too far. That said, I think that some parts of the enactivist literature are certainly compatible also with the way I would characterize things. So, it really depends.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree, for example, with Christopher Peacock's approach to, I think he has a representationalist approach to self-consciousness and intersubjectivity in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of the things in Peacock's work, and I engaged quite a bit with his work on non-conceptual content, of course, and also his recent book is very interesting, and I think in a lot of aspects we agree with each other. There's maybe certain minor points where we disagree, where he thinks that even at the very basic level, we already, he would characterize even a basic level of consciousness as entailing a DC component, as a kind of self-awareness. And I would disagree with that. But yeah, generally speaking, I think there's a lot of overlap between our work.
Okay. So can we talk about something more broader? What is your general position on the nature of consciousness, for example?
Yeah, I was a bit worried about that question because I don't really have a general position on that.
Okay.
But I mean, so generally speaking, I'm very sympathetic to so-called non-reductive naturalistic approaches. So,
yes.
Positions that describe consciousness as an emergent phenomenon, for instance. That seems to me to make intuitive sense. Like, consciousness, I think, is something that certainly has to do with complexity and has to do with the ability to engage with the world in intentional terms. But I don't see it as opposed to a naturalism that's broadly construed. So it depends on how we understand naturalism. But
that would be the next question. Yeah. How do you see naturalism in general? Would you agree that you are defending a naturalist theory of self-consciousness?
Yeah, I would say so, insofar as I would see myself as trying to establish a theory that acknowledges that as humans, we are part of the natural world. We are, in a sense, animals. But because we have self-consciousness, and that kind of brings us back to the start, in a way, of course, we're sort of transcending nature, if you wish, because on the basis of our abilities for reflection and thinking about ourselves, we are able to set our own aims and goals in a way, right? So we can ask, what do I want to achieve? Who do I want to be? I'm not tied to my nature, as it were, in the same way as an animal is. Or, I mean, you can't even really speak of there being one particular human nature that we're kind of tied to, right? So in a sense, we are able to transcend this. But I like this. I like the way in which McDowell and others, for instance, frame this in terms of the distinction between a first and a second nature. So we have this first nature as embodied organisms, as animals of a certain kind, and then with our conceptual abilities, with our abilities for self-consciousness and self-reflection, we acquire the second nature, which is not opposed. I mean, it's still a natural phenomenon. It's not something mysterious or something outside of nature, but it enables us to, yeah, like I said, set our own aims and define our own goals and change and shape our own trajectory of how we move through life.
So what would you say, apart from, of course, being able to think I thoughts and have reflective self-consciousness, is something that separates us from other animals, other living beings? I mean, could it be like sociality, intersubjectivity, or sociality different in humans, and so this enables us to acquire self-consciousness and the ability to think I thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, of course, many animals, many organisms are extremely social, but I think that what makes us perhaps slightly different, and that's not my theory, but if you look at people like Michael Tomasello or other anthropologists put forward this idea, which I find quite plausible, that over the course of evolution, we needed to evolve ways of interacting with each other that allowed for cooperation across much larger groups and in a much broader scale. And one idea is that in order to do so, we became particularly sensitive to social cues, but also particularly sensitive to something like social norms. And we developed a kind of a norm psychology, if you wish. And that then ultimately feeds into these processes that we've talked about, the development of self-consciousness and intersubjectivity, but then also things like morality, right? And so, yeah, I think in contrast to other animals, then we developed this ability to ask questions of moral significance, to ask about values, as an individual, but also as a society. How do we want to live? How do we want to structure our lives together? That is not unnatural in the sense that I think, you can tell a story about how we evolved these abilities, but then at the same time, it enables us to move in a certain way beyond nature.
So yes, as I understood this, is this your current research, the problem of normativity, the origin of normativity?
Yeah, that's... Sorry.
No problem. When you wrote the book, you ended it with these questions about the narrative self, the diachronical sense of self, and so on, the questions that haven't been answered in the book. So are you working on this kind of topics right now?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I'm very much interested in trying to understand better the origins of normativity, and also the way in which our identities are shaped, again, through interacting with others at the individual level, but also at the kind of broader societal, cultural level. I'm very much interested in this context, in these mind-shaping approaches that are also getting more traction in developmental psychology at the moment. But yeah, generally asking how, our sense of self, our sense of identity, including our sense of our ethical identity, is really shaped by the way in which we engage with others at the individual level, as well as at the broader cultural and societal level.
Okay. So would you say that for example, in philosophy, you said you have a more of an analytical approach. You follow that kind of tradition, of course, but do you think that phenomenology is also important for understanding these problems?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've never been from when I first started studying philosophy, I've always actually, a lot of my training was in analytical philosophy, but I've always been also interested in engaging with phenomenological literature. as well as then, of course, literature from different disciplines, but also, I mean, this, generally speaking, the so-called divide between analytical and continental philosophy seems to me to be misguided. So I've always been more interested in the kind of questions that people ask. And if I feel that someone has a similar question, it doesn't really matter whether they come from a different so-called philosophical tradition. I think it's definitely very valuable to engage with literature from different traditions as long as there is some common ground and some kind of common questions.
Yes, because there is a lot of this discussion in phenomenology, exactly in these topics about intersubjectivity, sharing of experiences, sociality, and I think even the most famous and greatest of the phenomenologists would agree with this theme that you have through your book and through your work, that it is intersubjectivity and our relations with other subjects that shape or help us develop our sense of self. So would you say that at the basic level, there is no personal identity at the minimal level, or do you think that the personal identity is something at the narrative level, something that is made possible by an I concept that one has of oneself, and through that concept, the story that he tells of himself or what he sees about himself? Or is there like a more diachronical persistence theory of the self that is more basic than that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't really have a fully developed theory of personal identity, but I would agree that a lot of a large part of that is based in something like a narrative, which again is shaped by ourselves as much as by others, right? So when you think of young children, then a lot of their narrative sense of self comes from the stories that their caregivers and their surrounding community tells about them, and then later on we kind of pick that up and maybe gain a little bit more authority in telling our own narrative, but still it's always influenced by others, again, be it by our direct family, friends, but also cultural narratives that influence us, etc. And so, yeah, I think that's this kind of narrative level is where I would probably locate an identity, personal identity in that stronger sense. Which again is not to say that, of course, even at the pre-reflective level, there might be something like a personality or certain predispositions and certain character traits that we may become equipped with from birth onwards, and that also feed into this in certain basic fundamental level in the way in which we experience the world. But yeah.
Okay, but yes, you would say that at the pre-reflective level, some kind of self-awareness, if there is such a thing, like for me-ness or minus, whatever you call it, would be non-representational. There wouldn't be any representation of the self in that kind of awareness in any sense. So
yes, yeah, I'm not an intentional object in that sense at the pre-reflective level.
Okay, that would be at the phenomenological aspect, but at the metaphysical aspect, what do you think the self or the subject is? Do you have any ideas?
I don't know. I generally try to stay out of metaphysical questions. Okay. I'm not really sure what to think about that. Yeah, so I don't know.
But again, it seems for people, it is the phenomenological aspect that is more important for our life, basically. It is the phenomenology that counts, but for philosophy, of course, it is metaphysics in a way.
Yeah, but I mean, both are very important and both are very interesting questions. But yeah, I just have to admit I don't have a firm view on the metaphysics of the self. I mean, I would probably tend towards views that identify the self with the kind of organism that we are. But yeah,
or complex systems.
Yes.
Okay. Perhaps for the end, could you say that I don't know what is the coronavirus situation where you are now? Is it the same? Bad?
It's bad. Yeah.
It's still bad.
Yeah. Well, so I'm in Berlin right now, and yeah, I mean, it's like we came through the so-called the first wave quite well, and now the second wave is quite bad. And so, yeah, it's not quite clear where things are going. I mean, at the moment we have a lockdown, which is not a very strict lockdown, but yeah, my child, for instance, is at home, so she doesn't go to childcare at the moment, and I've been working from home basically since March. So, yeah,
it's the same.
I hope that things really we have a lot of people dying at the moment every day, and a lot of people are still getting infected every day. So my personal view is that I would hope actually that we would have stricter measures even than we have at the moment to really bring the numbers down.
So you are for the lockdown and stricter measures?
Yeah, I would like to have really a concerted effort where we really do a proper lockdown for a limited period of time. Given that we also now are starting to vaccinate people, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. But at the moment, it seems to me it's a little bit half-baked. So certain things are closed and then other things are open. And that doesn't seem to me to be a very good strategy, because I don't really see where it's going. Yeah.
It's not very effective. Okay.
Yeah.
So would you say that even this kind of process of isolation and quarantine has changed our intersubjectivity, our relations with others, to the point that it could influence some aspects of our personality? Or
yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think actually, sure, the situation is very difficult for many people, absolutely, and there's a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety involved. At the same time, it is still a limited period of time. And so I don't actually think that it will have fundamental effects. But then again, I'm not qualified to really give a prognosis on that. I mean, you'd better ask psychologists and sociologists and so on. For me personally, I'm like many philosophers, perhaps rather an introvert. So I quite like being on my own. And for me, the situation has actually been the opposite of isolation, in the sense that, my husband and my child are at home all the time now. So I feel I have very little time on my own, much less than I normally have. Of course, I do miss sort of direct interactions with my students and, people like you at workshops and so on. Everything is happening on the screen and people are getting a little bit tired.
It's not the same.
It's not the same, but yeah. Okay. But yeah, in some sense, my social interactions are more intense now than they used to be. And in another sense, with respect to colleagues and students and friends, of course, I have a lot less social interactions. But yeah, it's an interesting experience anyway.
Yeah. In a way, yeah. Okay, thank you. I think that would be about it. It was great talking to you. I hope everything works out well. You stay healthy and in good care at home. I await your next paper, or what are you working on right now, or next book.
Yeah. Yeah, there's different things. I'm working on papers on different topics, as well as, of course, a book which unfortunately I haven't made as much progress on, partly due to the pandemic and so on, as I would have liked this year. But yeah, hopefully next year or this coming year will be a little bit more productive in that respect.
Thank you. It was good talking to you.
Yeah, very nice talking to you too. And I hope things are also going well or getting better in where you are. What's the situation there? Actually,
we don't have a lockdown right now. We're at the end of I don't know, third wave, something like that. Or the vaccination is starting. The process of vaccination is starting. So we are hopeful about that, but basically still the same like last year. So still that numbers are very high. But yeah, hopefully it will get better in this year.
Yeah, I hope so.
For everyone, thank you for listening and watching us, and stay tuned for more interviews with philosophers, scientists, and theologians on the topics of the origins.